want to say good morning to Julia and Mary and Rochelle and Barbara, and Robert, who I haven't had a chance to greet yet, and Hal and Marion. So nice to have you join in. Psalm 38. This is now we're in mid stride, getting into the rhythm. As I mentioned, just a word before I begin. There are 41 Psalms in the first book of Psalms. So this week will be 38, 39, and 40. And next week is Tisha B'Av, and that's Wednesday night and Thursday. So we'll have class just Tuesday and Wednesday, meaning we'll both celebrate the day before Tisha B'Av, the completion of book 1, and then start the next book. So let me welcome you now formally. Let me make sure we're recording. It looks like we are. Psalm 38. Psalm 38, I found to be the most painful of the Psalms to date. You know, when I look at a Psalm, there's obviously, as in this case, 23 verses. You don't know where to focus because there's much said. But I look at the first verse, the last verse, and then the middle verse. And often the middle verse is kind of the bullseye of the core of what a psalm is. And listen to the middle verse of this psalm, which is verse 12. Those who love me and who I befriended stand aloof from my affliction, and my family at a distance they stand. This verse distinctly is the pain of isolation in a far more extreme way than we've seen. There are common themes, as you're seeing in Psalms. There's often the struggle against enemies, the struggle to be righteous, to be vindicated by God and delivered from enemies. Those are common motifs, and motifs that figure into King David's life. Now, the classic commentators will identify this psalm as King David after his affair with the wife of Uriah, with Bathsheba. And after that affair, they'll have a child that will die. He will, of course, have sent her husband, when he finds that his lover is pregnant, he sends her husband to the front line to die. And that's a low point in King David's life. The prophet Nathan will say to King David, what do you think about a man who took the only lamb from a poor man, and this rich man took it away, and he said that man should be burned? And Nathan says, that man is you. And King David will say, I am guilty. I mean, he does in that moment acknowledge his wrongdoing, and the rabbis will say he's only forgiven for such an egregious sin with his own death, the rabbis of the Talmud. So that moment of wrongdoing, that extreme wrongdoing, is surely beyond anything I would anticipate any of us have ever been party to. And that will raise a question that I will look to address at the end of our sharing, and that's, what's the value of reading something that's so extreme? What do we whose lives aren't as extreme gain from these, if you will, outside brackets of lived experience? For me, this psalm is an outside bracket. I don't necessarily or at all see this as written by King David, though it's possible in that moment. What I see this psalm is as a listening in to a conversation with God, in which this individual is clinically depressed. That's the only way I can understand verse 12. that middle verse where he feels that nobody wants to get near him. Remember those words, those who love me and who I befriended stand aloof from my affliction, and even my family at a distance they stand. This is a man who is so remarkably isolated, who sees himself as a pariah to everybody else. So the first line in the open and the last line. The first line, begin again, verse 2. The first word is Adonai, my Yud-He Vav-He, that intimate name for God. Do not in your anger rebuke me, nor in your wrath chasten me. Well, in a moment when I read the psalm, you'll see that verses 2 to 11 are a description of a person who is physically suffering. His body is in pain in the most descriptive ways, and he's also in emotional anguish. This is not a psalm that he's speaking to other people. He's only addressing God. And the word you, as he addresses God, is repeated over and over, and the word me or my is over and over. It's as if we are listening in to a very private conversation. And so this psalm begins with the word Adonai, that intimate name for God. Do not in your anger rebuke me, nor in your wrath chasten me. There's an element of this psalm that is, if you will, the anti-Job, meaning here the psalter is suffering. But here the psalter will say, I know that my suffering is brought by you, God, because of my wrongdoing. So unlike Job, who would say, and we'll see this in verse 39, 39 is Job more. And they're a pair today and tomorrow of darkness, the darkness of the soul. But here, a description of physical suffering is clearly seen as a verdict by God. And then verses 12 to 17 will be God, the people's reaction to the Psalter. Verses 18 and 19 will be a summary of the illness. Verses 20 and 21, a summary of people's reaction. And the final two verses, the Psalter's prayer. And so the last line, hasten to help me, my superior. Chusha le'ezrati Adonai, teshuati, my deliverance. So in his state of despair, feeling like an emotional pariah, his one source of comfort is God, who he sees as causing his suffering, and yet the hope of release. So let me read it now in English, and I'll point out a couple of interesting ambiguities, and then come back to this final question. This psalm is so extreme in its pain. Why and do we read it? It's not something that found its way into our prayers other than one line, the closing line, into praying on Monday and Thursday of Tachanun, words of repentance. What do we gain from extremes? The Psalm 38. Let me post it. A Psalm of David, Lahaskir, to prompt remembrance. Adonai, do not in your anger rebuke me, nor in your wrath chasten me. For your arrows have landed into me, and landing upon me has come your hand. There is no wholesome spot in my flesh because of your rage, nor is there any shalom, any peace in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have passed over my head. As a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. My wounds stink. They fester because of my foolishness. I am crooked and bowed down greatly. All the day in gloom I go. For my lower spine is filled with burning, and there is no wholesome spot in my flesh. I am benumbed and crushed greatly. I roar because of the turmoil of my heart, my superior. Before you are all my desires, and my groaning is not hidden from you. My heart flutters, my strength has abandoned me, and the light of my eyes, they too are gone from me. Those who love me and who I befriended stand aloof from my affliction, and my family, at a distance they stand, and they lay snares for me who seek after my spirit, and they who pursue my hurt. Deceits all day long they mutter. But I am as if deaf, unable to hear, and I am as if dumb, unable to open mouth. Let me be like a person who does not hear, and in whose mouth are no rebukes. For in you, Adonai, do I hope. You will answer, my superior, my God. For I said, they will rejoice over me. When my foot slips over me, they will magnify themselves. For I am about to collapse, and my pain is before me always. For my iniquity I do declare. I worry on account of my sin. But my enemies are alive with strength, and many are those who hate me with a lie. They who repay evil for good harass me, because I pursue goodness. Do not abandon me, Adonai, my God. Do not distance from me. Hasten to help me, my superior, my deliverance. So, a few thoughts in terms of some ambiguities, just to point out. I will note that verse 2 and the prayer of the final two verses, 22 and 23, are the inclusio, meaning they're Adonai, do not in your anger rebuke me, nor in your wrath chasten me. Do not abandon me, Adonai, my God. Do not distance from me. Hasten to help me, my superior, my deliverance. But what's interesting to note is, although he is suffering, he doesn't ask God to heal him explicitly. He doesn't ask God to revenge his enemies, as we've seen in other Psalms. All he asks in this prayer is for God's presence. Do not abandon me. Do not in your anger rebuke me. So the longing here in his loneliness, in his pariah, set apart from others, is that God and God alone will be present for him. And at the same time, he sees his suffering as due to his own wrongdoing. Verse 5, for my iniquities have passed over my head as a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me. In this case, verse 5 is understood both by Rabbi David Kimchi, that early Spanish commentator, and Robert Alter, a modern commentator, as the image of drowning. Again, verse 5, the iniquities are over his head like water, and he is as if drowning because of his sin. And then as a heavy burden, they're too heavy for me. So he acknowledges wrongdoing and sees God. Look at verse 3. For your arrows have landed into me, and landing upon me has come your hand. And again, as in other Psalms, you see the repetition of words. Here, the landing, nechatu, that's, an airplane today is nachat. To rest is also nachat. These things have come into me, they rest on me, they are too heavy and burdensome for me, and it's you, God, bringing this suffering. Painful line, verse 6, my wounds stink, they fester because of my foolishness. Verse 8, here's an interesting play. on a word, ki kisalai, for my lower spine. That's an interpretation, as is every translation. Leviticus 3:4, you get the image of kisalai being that part of the body, the lower spine. But kesel is also a fool. And for I am foolish, filled with, malu, filled with, and nikle, here I translate as burning, which is how, from the word nikla, means inflamed. But Rashi, the great French 11th century commentator, will see the root as kal, which means light or insignificance, which is to say, again, verse 8, because of my foolishness, I was filled with lightness, with insignificance, the lightness of being. And there is no, here's another translation word, mitom. We saw this word tam often used in Psalms positively as pure or integrity, simple. Here it's used with to say ein mitom. There is no purity in my flesh. There is no, I chose the word wholesome because tam is often in a positive way, right? Ish tam is somebody with integrity, a wholesome person. They are clearly who they say they are inside and out. In terms of inside and out, you have images here where you don't know if the pain is inside or out. For instance, verse 4, there is no wholesome spot in my flesh because of your rage. Again, repetition. Here you get that tom bifsari, that same Hebrew word, wholesome spot. Nor is there any shalom in my bones. And rather than being bones, atsamai can be bones or it can be in my inner. There is no peace in my inwardness. So I do highlight, as we have the privilege of taking a little longer in our reading, to remember that every translation is an interpretation, whether verse 4 is both about the physical, or is it also about the internal in the second half? Or is it about both simultaneously? Because ambiguity, or if you will, double entendre, more than one meaning, is the nature of poetry. Here's what's different about this poem than others, and it's something Robert Alter highlights. Normally, we find that now here, actually, it's I'm getting ahead because I prepared already verse 39. And my comment is going to be for verse 39. So here, note, because this will be relevant to tomorrow, these are couplets, right? For my iniquities have passed over my head. Verse 5, as a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. So it's two things for emphasis. There's a symmetry. Verse 6, my wounds stink. They fester because of my foolishness. It explains why these wounds are continuing to fester, but there's a parallel, an emphasis in the first parts of that. Tomorrow, and I'll come back to this tomorrow, the Robert Alter insight is they will be triplets, not doublets, which in Psalms, they're almost all doublets in terms of a poetic construction. And we'll talk tomorrow about what is the impact of having a triplet versus a doublet. So let me return to my central question. I'm going to now stop this share so I can see you. I want to also see who we have with us today. I will say that I read this psalm with a particular lens. And I do so with some awareness of the need to protect privacy. But I will tell you, in this time of COVID, I have done 2 events for adults, for families of adults who have taken their life in the last few weeks. Each is a separate story. Each is a need for a quality of privacy around that, because we still have in our culture, and understandably, a taboo around mental illness and suffering of that deepest spiritual kind. And I read this psalm preparing for one of those events, and it just felt so painful to me, because as I read this psalm with that lens, I very profoundly felt the pain of deep depression that can lead to even taking one's life to turn off the pain. Some of you know that in my 20s, I was a mental patient, and I was hospitalized initially at my own request in 3 hospitals, one of which I escaped from. No small achievement to escape from a locked mental ward. That's an aside, but I was out of my mind and suicidal. And it gave me the experience in my 20s, in my case, prompted by encephalitis, kind of a swelling of the brain lining that throws one's brain chemistry on tilt, but still a full-blown clinical depression with suicidal ideation that gave me the taste of ashes in my mouth that I can still recall, the most painful experience of my life. Now, in contrast to this Psalter, I always knew there were people who loved me, but I didn't love myself. I just felt this enormous pain that I was no good, not worthy, all irrational, nothing rational about it from hindsight, but in the experience, profoundly real, profoundly painful. And when I read the quality of this man's pain who's writing this psalm, all the more in the context of these losses in our community, I just feel this is the most extreme of the Psalms. And again, that middle verse, that verse 12, even those who love me and who I befriended stand aloof from my affliction, and my family at a distance they stand, and they lay snares for me who seek after my spirit. This is, again, such depths of pain, of isolation, of feeling paranoid, of unworthy, that I'm just with goosebumps as I share it, because one, of having at least tasted that quality of depth of pain. And it leaves me, because I don't live, frankly or fortunately, in that quality of pain, though it is one of my greatest resources as a caregiver, of helping families who've had a loss and saying to them, you know, this too is sad and part of life. And when somebody is so in pain and just wants to turn it off, it's not you to control, because there's always that feeling of I could have or should have done something, which can lead to, damn it, why didn't I do something? And self-chastisement. And I'm very protective, as much as I can, of families who've had such a loss, not to feel in their own way responsible and pained, because that's not usually the reality. The reality is a person in this quality of pain is self-choosing isolation because of the pain and wanting to control their fate and control their pain. Now, this psalm is a little different in that at least this psalter has God. I don't know how and why, but in this case, the psalter feels that God is present and is a hope. But I still return to the pain of the psalter. And my closing question, why is this in our Psalms? Why did we preserve such an extreme expression of isolation and pain? And my sense is that, one, it's because this is a canvas, and it's the power of Psalms, of the life of community. In fact, some classic commentators will say of all these Psalms, this one included, This is the people of Israel speaking and addressing God. This isn't David. This is David on behalf of the people of Israel saying, everybody's against us. We're alone. They torture us. We only turn to you. I've heard that expression as part of the aftermath, for instance, of the Holocaust. But even to go there pains me as it also being inaccurate, but understandable. But back to the question, why remember it? It's because this is part of the canvas of life. This is the extreme, if you will. This is the black on the weave that allows colors of greater joy to pop. But the other is because we learn from extremes. If we're blessed, we never go to that place of great wrongdoing, as of the example, right, of King David, and his literally sending a man to die, setting him up, literally killing somebody by virtue of sending Uriah to protect himself from it being found out that he had engaged in adultery. So that's an extreme, both adultery, getting somebody pregnant as a result of adultery, and then sending the husband to die. That's not a place that I fortunately have gone. So David and Abraham and our biblical characters, their lives are so much more extreme than ours, for good and for bad. And my sense is we go to these extremes because they do illuminate our lives, precisely because they bring into sharp relief the possibilities of what it means to be human in the extreme of good and bad. And that's of value. That's the nature of literature. Literature often presents extremes because they illuminate for what is for us something less extreme in our lives, but yet a seed, yet a reflection, much less black or white, but an extreme gives us an ability to bring to the foreground our own pain, our own isolation, and also relief last. It's also the relief of saying, thank God, putting our pain into perspective. For the grace of God, I don't go there. And I add, for the grace of God, because these are religious psalms. The context is a belief that there is a caring creator, a caring presence, a caring moral authority who is there to help us amidst our pain. And that's the opening and the closing of this psalm. The Psalter doesn't say, God, heal me. The Psalter doesn't say, even punish my enemies for their wickedness. It's, God, embrace me despite my sin. Be present for me so that I can live. Tomorrow, I'm going to foreshadow, there is something that is unique in Psalms, the closing line. I say 38 and 39 go together, and 39, the closing line is, God, just leave me alone so that I be no more. We'll see that tomorrow. Coming attractions. 38 and 39 are dark. They're dark, they're painful. They're probably the darkest, most painful that I've experienced the Psalms. And I say that I've experienced because these are not Psalms that are part of our normal liturgy. There have been individual verses taken out. Stravinsky pulls out one of the lines in our psalm, but these are not part of what we think of as prayer, because again, I think they're just too extreme and too dark to live with as part of our psalms, and yet they are part of the corpus of our sacred text. With that, let me invite you to share a reaction or two, and then I will close with the opportunity for those to say Kaddish. So do we have an opening of a line or two of response or reaction or question?
I have one.
Go ahead, Mike.
Earlier today, I was preparing for this class by studying it. And what struck me right off the bat is most of the Psalms, certainly those that we've went through so far, begin with a psalm for David, a psalm for the conductor, to David. This one begins with a psalm from David to remind or to proclaim, as if clearly it's good to be king. Maybe he's not so depressed. It's also fair to assume that at this stage of his life, he's not a teenager or in his 20s, where most of the episode of psychotic episodes happen. So this is probably much made later in life. And what I kept on wondering as I was reading it and trying to understand, both in English and Hebrew, why does it have to have the word leaskir, to remind or to proclaim, as opposed to just a psalm for David? And the only thing
So
I
let's
can, please,
go ahead, Mike. No, go ahead. The only thing you could think.
the only thing I can think of initially was, wait, it's not him. He's talking on behalf of somebody else, something that you have addressed. And also I was thinking, goodness, I mean, King David, the greatest king we ever had, 40 years, leading the people and so on, doing so many things, good and bad. Why do we need this? Why do we need something that is so deep in despair? Um, it's certainly a food for thoughts, something to think
Yeah.
about.
So let
Um,
me respond to that, Mike, and note what Mike's focusing in on is verse 1, which begins, not uncommonly, Mizmor David, a psalm for David. And then there's a third word, lahaskir, which can either mean to remembrance, to prompt remembrance. It only appears in one other psalm, and that's Psalm 70, which is a very different psalm. That's a psalm about punish my enemies. So Mike asks, why this unusual addition of lahaskir to prompt remembrance? Who needs to remember, and what does this psalm seek to prompt? And in response, Mike, I'll also add, the opening line might have been, as many of these inscriptions, added later. So the poem comes, and then it's given the inscriptions, as we'll see when we study the Psalms. So somebody reads this deeply painful psalm and says, this is to remember this moment, this low point. And then it's a very good question that Mike leaves us with. Who is being asked to remember, and remember what? Is it David seeking to remember the low point of his emotional life and not wanting to forget it? Or is it for us to remember that even David had such a low point? Or as a community to remember the need of God in our low points? So that's left there to ponder and play with. Let me point out one other thing that, again, there's so much to share about this. Here in verse 9, I just want to contrast how this is a poem about inner. Verse 9 was, I am benumbed and crushed greatly. I roar. And it's the same word used like in Amos for a lion. I roar because of the turmoil of my heart. And then it'll say in verse 14, but I am as if dumb, unable to open mouth. Now that may be consecutively, but I tend to read them together, that this is a psalm that's all about his inner expression. He's not speaking out loud, if you will. He is expressing to God what is going on with his inner turmoil. This is a psalm of inward pain. One more comment. Rochelle Amberson, let me unmute you. One second, Rochelle. Can you speak, Rochelle? Can you unmute yourself? Go ahead, Rochelle.
Okay, I've worked with people who've had this depth of despair, and we have a saying that the body tells the tale. What's going on inside is frequently manifested by the body and his reliance on these physical things. What I'm kind of focused on is the fact that he never talks about what he's done, because what's wrong is him. That's his feeling. And I don't know what the religious aspects are, but that's what really stood out for me. I've seen this, I've worked with this.
Yeah. So I just want to build on Rochelle's comment. One, to acknowledge that this is real,
Yeah.
whether it has one's own story or the story of those we know who've experienced a quality of self-isolation and despair that is the extreme, and that this is part of real life. So that's the first thing to acknowledge.
I have a comment about that.
Go ahead,
Without it being named what's wrong, it makes it applicable in many cases, rather than many people could relate to it, whether for themselves or for other people.
Yes.
So that's good back and forth with Michelle's comment that there isn't specificity of what wrongs he's feeling guilty over or responsible for in punishment. And as Mimi says, the value of that is it allows everyone to fill in the blank of their own wrongdoing or shortcoming. Closing comment, and then I'll pull this together. So I don't see any.
Marvin has his hand up.
Barbara does?
Marvin.
Okay, go ahead, Marvin. Can you unmute yourself? This is my first day going solo.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. When I read Psalms, I try to relate modern society, modern occurrences, etc. And I just was thinking how applicable this would be to a president of the United States by the name of Clinton, who indulged into iniquities in very, very much the same manner. Maybe not as severe, but how it still applies even today.
You know, that's what Yitzhak Rabin said to Clinton when he met with him after the Monica Lewinsky scandal. He said even King David had acts that marred him, but still he had to go on and lead. So back to Marvin's relevance of a sin like this. And again, to pull this together, this can be a moment in time and the low point for the Psalter, rather than an enduring place. I mentioned the extreme of suicidal depression, but here's a case where hopefully the Psalter recovered and got his bearing and put into context his wrongdoing. It leaves open the question I will look to address with you tomorrow more fully, and that's the theological question. Is it God who, verse 3, for your arrows have landed into me, and landing upon me has come your hand? Is it God who brings physical illness as a punishment for moral wrongdoing? The classic biblical theology, and I will look at that tomorrow. Ahuva, I love you, but I want to pull this together. So you want to take one last moment? I wouldn't say no, but I'm concerned about people's time. Go ahead, Ahuva, one sentence. You want to pass? Okay, tomorrow, be the first one. I always value what you have to say, Ahuva, but I don't want to go too long. Let me just bring up the shared screen for Kaddish. One one moment if I can do that. 1 second. All right. Today, 1 second. Somehow I have to practice that for tomorrow. I'm sharing my second screen. So join me if you know the Kaddish and have the need to recite today. Yitkadal,
Yitgadal
Yitkadash,
v'yitgadash shemei
Shemei
Rabba
Rabbah,
Amen.
Alma Divra
v'yivra
Kirute,
chirutei
V'yamliach Malchute,
v'yamalchutei
B'chayechon
v'chayachon
Yomechon,
v'yomechon
Chayei
uv'chayei
Kol Beit
all Beit
Yisrael,
Yisrael
Ba'agala Uvizman
v'vishman
Kariv
kariv
V'yimru
yimru
Amen.
Amen.
Yehi
v'hei
Shmei
shmei
Rafa
Rabban
Mevorach Leolam
le'olam
Omeo Maya.
le'olam
Yitbarach
yitbarach
V'yishtabach
v'yishtabach
V'yita'ar
v'yita'ar
V'yitromam
Yitramam
v'yitramam
V'yitnaseh
v'yitnaseh
V'yitadar
Yitadar
v'yitala
V'yitalel
Yitala
Shmei
Shmei Dekudusha
Uvra
Brichu
Urichu
v'richu
Ela
Ela
Mincho
Mincho
Kal
Birchata
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 V'shirata
Shirata Tishbechata
V'yishbata
Tushbachata
Neshemata
Neshemata
Damiran Be'alav
Miran
Imru
Bioma
Amen.
V'alma
Amen.
V'imru Amen.
Yehei
Yahei
Yeh
Shalom
Rafa
Maraba
Min
Min
Shemayim
Shmaya
Shemayan
V'chayim
Chayim
V'chaim
Aleinu
Aleinu
Yokol
V'yakal
Yisrael
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 Imru
Amen.
Amen.
V'imru
Ose
Amen.
Shalom
Oseh
Rama
Shalom
Shalom
B'Rahman
Bimrumav Hu
V'yaseh
V'yaseh
Yaseh
Shalom
Shalom
Aleinu
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 Kol
Kol
V'yakal
Yisrael
Yisrael
Kol
Chayot
Yoshvei
V'imru
Israel
Amen.
Imru
V'imru
Amen.
Amen. I invite you to join me at 5 o'clock if you're available, a public conversation on COVID land. I look to facilitate more than speak, to facilitate a conversation of, in this novel journey that we've shared over the last 3 months, what has the experience been like for you? What have you taken from it that surprises you? And where do you see us going? So 5 o'clock tonight for like a 45-minute conversation. Thank each of you for joining
Yeah.
me. I look
Thank
to
you.
Thank you.
Psalm 39, again, another dark psalm, tomorrow at 10 o'clock.